Welcome to Echoes of Holmes, where every shadow hides a secret. Tonight we enter the world of Sherlock Holmes in The Mystery of the Stolen Atlas, a vanished treasure map, a library cloaked in silence, and a thief with a dangerous design. Where in the world are you joining us from? Let us know in the comments. Now pour yourself something warm and let the mystery begin. It was in the late autumn of 1893 that I found myself once again seated before the crackling fire of our chambers at Baker Street, enjoying the calm that followed a week of incessant rain. Holmes, as ever, was restless in idleness. His long, slender fingers drummed against the arm of his chair, while his hawk-like profile was silhouetted against the lamplight. I had learned to recognize that particular pose as a harbinger of some intellectual storm yet to come. My prediction was not long in waiting. Mrs. Hudson entered with her usual quiet efficiency, bearing a card upon a tray. Holmes seized it, his keen eyes narrowing as he read. "Ha! Watson, here is a visitor whose predicament promises something out of the ordinary. Allow me to introduce you in a moment to Mr. Reginald Hartwell, Curator of the Royal Geographical Society." "The Geographical Society?" I exclaimed. "Surely such men concern themselves with maps and exploration, not with the affairs of crime." "Precisely why his visit intrigues me," Holmes replied, rising with the energy of a man abruptly awakened. Our guest entered shortly thereafter, a gentleman of perhaps 50, his attire refined, but his face pale with agitation. He wasted no time in pleasantries. "Mr. Holmes, I come in desperation. An object of great scholarly and national importance has been stolen from our archives, the Atlas of Sir Erasmus Pelham, compiled during his voyages at the close of the last century." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "An atlas, you say? A most unusual quarry for a thief. Pray proceed." Hartwell explained that this atlas was no ordinary collection of maps, but a unique work containing hand-drawn charts, annotations of uncharted coasts, and marginal notes hinting at discoveries yet unpublished. Its disappearance from the locked strong room of the Society, sometime in the previous 2 nights, had shaken not only his trustees, but the Foreign Office itself, for portions of the atlas were rumoured to contain sensitive geographical observations along colonial frontiers. The matter was reported to Scotland Yard, Hartwell continued, but Inspector Lestrade confessed himself entirely at a loss. No forced entry, no signs of tampering with the lock, and the watchman swears he saw no intruder. And yet the atlas has vanished. Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers. Fascinating. A theft with no apparent means, and of an object whose value is intellectual rather than monetary. Tell me, who had access to the strong room? Only myself, 2 assistants, and the secretary of the Society, Mr. Algernon St. Clair. Holmes's lips curved in a thin smile. A small circle of suspects, Watson, always an encouraging sign. And what of the motive? That, I think, will prove the greater puzzle. For who steals knowledge, and to what end? The curator bowed his head. "That, sir, is precisely why I implore your aid. The trustees insist the atlas must be recovered before the scandal spreads. They fear espionage or worse." Holmes rose abruptly, his eyes alight with that peculiar fire which only the scent of an enigma could ignite. "Very well, Mr. Hartwell. Dr. Watson and I shall accompany you at once to the Society. I would like to see this strong room for myself. I dare say it will yield more to the trained eye than it has to Inspector Lestrade's." As we set out into the fog-bound streets, I could not suppress a thrill of anticipation, for here, at last, was a case in the true spirit of my friend's genius, a vanishing treasure of knowledge, a theft cloaked in impossibility, and motives hidden as deep as the secrets of the Atlas itself. The cab rattled along the mist-laden thoroughfares of London, its lanterns glowing faintly against the dense November fog. The rhythmic clatter of hooves echoed hollowly as though the city itself had muffled its usual vigour in sympathy with the gloom. Seated opposite Holmes, I could discern little of his face, save for the occasional gleam of his eyes, which seemed brighter in shadow than in sunlight. He smoked in contemplative silence, the thin wreaths of smoke curling upward and mingling with the cab's damp air. Mr. Hartwell, meanwhile, fidgeted with his gloves, twisting them into shapes which betrayed the depth of his agitation. His words tumbled forth as though silence were unbearable. "You must understand, gentlemen, that Sir Erasmus Pelham was no common geographer. He was a visionary, a man whose notes straddled the line between science and diplomacy. There are suggestions, mere whispers, that his atlas contains references to treaties unratified, to claims unacknowledged, even to routes for trade that might be of immense strategic value. Were such knowledge to fall into foreign hands, it could prove most injurious to the Crown." Holmes, who had until now seemed to ignore the torrent, removed his pipe from his lips. "And yet, Mr. Hartwell, you must know that secrets of such gravity are seldom confined to parchment alone. Governments talk, diplomats whisper, adventurers boast. The value of this atlas, I suspect, lies not merely in its utility, but in the fact that it represents a symbol and emblem of authority, of discovery, of national pride." Hartwell looked at him with a mixture of relief and perplexity. "That is precisely the point, Mr. Holmes. If this symbol has been tampered with, it strikes at the very heart of the Society's reputation. The trustees will not rest until it is restored." Holmes gave a short laugh, though without mirth. "Reputation is often a harsher master than truth, my dear sir. But fear not your atlas, or at least the mystery surrounding its absence shall soon be within our grasp. I would like to see the evidence first-hand." By now we had reached the sober façade of the Royal Geographical Society. Its great stone pillars loomed solemnly in the gaslight, while the watchman on duty saluted Hartwell with a respect that bordered on reverence. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old leather bindings, ink, and a distant atmosphere in which centuries of knowledge seemed compressed into silence. Hartwell led us down a dim corridor to the strong room, a narrow passage guarded by a heavy oak door bound with iron. Producing a key from his chain, he unlocked it with care, as though even the act of turning the key was a ritual not to be performed lightly. The chamber beyond was small but secure stone walls, a low ceiling, and a series of shelves upon which rested leather-bound folios and scrolls. A single gasket flickered, casting grotesque shadows across the rows of volumes. On one central table lay a velvet cloth, conspicuously bare. "It was here, upon this table, that the Pelham Atlas rested," Hartwell said with a sigh. "Each evening I examined it myself, ensuring its preservation. And yet 2 nights passed when I came, as is my habit, it was gone." Holmes strode forward at once, examining the table, the walls, the shelves, and finally the lock itself. His movements were brisk, precise, and curiously silent, save for the occasional murmur, Peculiar, indeed." Lestrade, who had been leaning against the far wall with his usual air of scepticism, stepped forward at last. His squat figure and sharp features were made harsher by the gaslight. "Well, Mr. Holmes, you may turn it about as you please, but you will find no sign of forced entry. The lock is sound, the hinges untouched, and the watchman swears he never left his post. Unless the Atlas sprouted legs and walked away, I say it must have been one of the insiders." Holmes inclined his head politely. "A natural conclusion, Inspector, though perhaps a premature one. If the thief were within your small circle of insiders, why leave no trace? Theft is usually clumsy, hurried. This was executed with delicacy." "Delicacy!" Lestrade scoffed. You make it sound like surgery." "Precisely," Holmes returned, his eyes gleaming. "And what is surgery but the art of removing something vital without disturbing the body that contains it? Here we have an operation performed with a surgeon's precision." I could not suppress a smile at Holmes's metaphor, though I confess the puzzle remained opaque to me. He bent low to examine the stone floor, running his fingers lightly over its surface. Presently he rose, dusting his hands. "There is little here," he said at last, "that speaks directly to the untrained observer, but to the eye accustomed to trifles, that is another matter. Tell me, Mr. Hartwell, how many people knew of the Atlas' precise resting place?" "Only myself, Mr. St. Clair, the secretary, and my 2 assistants, Davies and Morton." Holmes made a note in his pocketbook. "And of these 4, who last handled the volume?" Hartwell hesitated. "Davies was asked to replace a protective cover upon it last week. Morton has not touched it in months. St. Clair, as secretary, occasionally inspects the folios, but I myself examined it the day before yesterday, and it was still present." Holmes tapped his pen thoughtfully against the book. "Interesting. And the watchman his station is where, precisely?" "Just outside this corridor. He commands a view of the only entrance." Holmes paced the small room slowly, his gaze darting to every corner, the flicker of the gaslight catching the sharp lines of his face. At length he paused before the velvet-draped table, staring at the empty space as though he could will the Atlas to reappear. "The problem," he said softly, "is not merely how the Atlas was taken, but why it was removed in such a manner. Knowledge is a commodity seldom stolen in silence. It is published, copied, disseminated. Yet here the original is spirited away as though the thief sought more than knowledge, perhaps leverage, or the mere spectacle of its disappearance." Hartwell wrung his hands. "Mr. Holmes, the trustees will scarcely care for such distinctions. To them the Atlas must be returned, and so it shall be if fate and logic permit." Holmes pocketed his notebook and turned abruptly to Lestrade. "Inspector, may I presume you have interviewed these assistants?" Lestrade nodded. "Aye, I've spoken with them both. Young fellows, Davies rather nervous, Morton cool as a cucumber. Both deny everything, of course. And St. Clair, the secretary, is as respectable a man as ever drew breath. I'd stake my reputation that he had no hand in this." Holmes smiled faintly. "A dangerous wager, Inspector. Reputations have often been the cloaks beneath which mischief works undisturbed. Nevertheless, I thank you for the particulars." With that, Holmes strode from the strong room, his coat swirling behind him. We followed in his wake, Hartwell trotting anxiously at his side. When we reached the grand hall of the society, Holmes paused beneath the dome, gazing upward as though the architecture itself contained the missing answer. "Watson," he said quietly, "does it not strike you as curious that an object of such importance could vanish without a whisper, and yet not a single detail of the scene bears the mark of disturbance? It is as though the Atlas consented to its own removal." I laughed uneasily. "Surely you do not mean to imply supernatural intervention?" "Supernatural? No, my dear fellow, only natural, but of a kind concealed from ordinary sight. Rest assured, the explanation will be earthly, though perhaps devilishly clever." At that moment, Hartwell pressed forward, his voice urgent. "Mr. Holmes, I beg you, what shall we do next?" Holmes glanced toward him with the air of a man half lost in his own calculations. "Next, Mr. Hartwell, we shall see these gentlemen, your assistants and your secretary. For I would like to hear their voices, observe their countenances, and measure the timbre of their denials. A lie, like a fingerprint, leaves its mark upon the keen observer." Thus resolved, we departed from the chamber of vanished maps, the echo of our footsteps mingling with the silent weight of centuries of exploration. I could not but feel that we had stepped into a labyrinth whose walls were yet unseen. And though Holmes walked with confidence, his eyes alight with that peculiar fire of his, I knew the heart of the mystery had scarcely begun to reveal itself. The morning that followed our first visit to the Royal Geographical Society was one of that damp and dreary character which renders London most oppressive. A dull fog clung to the streets, blurring the outlines of carriages and pedestrians into vague shadows. Within our quarters at Baker Street, Holmes displayed an energy quite at variance with the lethargy which the weather imposed upon me. He was at his chemical table when I rose, a row of test tubes gleaming in the lamplight, though the hour was scarcely past 9. "Watson," said he, holding a small scrap of cloth with his tweezers, said that even the dullest stone corridor can betray a whisper if only one listens right. This fragment, brushed from the strong-room floor, speaks louder to me than all the testimony of Inspector Lestrade. I took the cloth in my hand. It was of a coarse texture, faintly tinted with a peculiar blue. "A workman's garment?" I suggested. Holmes inclined his head, but did not answer directly. Instead, he placed the fragment carefully into an envelope and slipped it into his pocket-book. "Every puzzle," he remarked, "possesses a master key. Sometimes it lies in plain sight, at others it must be wrested from obscurity. Come, Watson, Mr. Hartwell awaits us for the interviews. I should not care to lose the advantage of an unguarded word." Thus it was that by mid-morning we found ourselves once again within the stately halls of the Society. Hartwell greeted us with anxious politeness, though his eyes betrayed a sleepless night. He ushered us into a small chamber off the main hall, furnished simply with a table, several chairs, and a carafe of water. "I have summoned the gentlemen as you requested, Mr. Holmes," said he. "They await in the library. Will you see them one by one?" "Indeed," Holmes replied. "We shall begin with Mr. Davies, if you please." A few moments later, a young man entered, a slight figure, perhaps 25, with sandy hair and spectacles that magnified his anxious eyes. He bowed awkwardly, his hands fidgeting with his cuffs, as he took the chair opposite Holmes. "Mr. Davies," said Holmes, his tone affable yet penetrating, "you have served as assistant to the curator for how long?" "3 years, sir," the young man stammered. "And during that time you have frequently handled valuable volumes?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes. It is my duty to inspect, catalogue, and preserve them." Holmes leaned forward. "And you last touched the Pelham Atlas when?" Davies swallowed hard. "A week ago, sir. Mr. Hartwell asked me to replace its protective cover. I handled it with great care. I swear it was in its place then." Holmes regarded him with a silence that seemed to magnify every tick of the clock. At last he asked quietly, "And where were you 2 nights past when the Atlas vanished?" "At home, sir. I live with my mother in Bloomsbury. She can vouch for me." Holmes's gaze travelled briefly to the young man's hands, which trembled slightly upon his knees. "Very good, Mr. Davies. That will be all for the present." The assistant departed with palpable relief. "Anxious," Holmes murmured, half to himself. "Yes, very anxious, but of what? Guilt, or the dread of implication?" Mr. Morton was next ushered in. In contrast to Davies, he was a man of sturdier frame, perhaps in his 30s, with a composed manner and a steady gaze. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his speech carried a tone of confidence. "You have been with the Society for how long, Mr. Morton?" Holmes asked. "Nearly 7 years, sir." "And your duties?" "Cataloguing primarily. I also assist in arranging exhibitions and advising scholars." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And your relation to the Pelham Atlas?" "I have seldom touched it. My work does not often involve such singular treasures. I saw it, of course, but I cannot recall handling it these past months." Holmes tilted his head. "Where were you on the night in question?" "At a lecture at the University College on the mineral compositions of African river basins. A dull affair, but one which occupied me till near midnight. There are many who can attest to my presence." "Indeed," Holmes said softly. His eyes flicked once more over the man before he dismissed him. The third figure to enter was of altogether different bearing. Mr. Algernon Sinclair, secretary of the Society, was a gentleman of perhaps 40, tall, dignified, and possessed of an ease of manner that bespoke long familiarity with the drawing-rooms of polite society. His attire was immaculate, his voice measured. "Mr. Sinclair," Holmes began, "you bear heavy responsibility as secretary. Doubtless you had occasion to examine the Pelham Atlas yourself?" "Certainly, Mr. Holmes, it is my charge to ensure all is in order within the Society. I have inspected the Atlas many times over the years. Only last week I showed it to a foreign scholar, though naturally under supervision." Holmes' eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "A foreign scholar, you say? May I inquire as to his name?" Sinclair hesitated, then answered smoothly, "A Mr. Heinrich Vogel, a German gentleman engaged in comparative geography." He was most appreciative of the work. Holmes made a note. "And on the night of the theft?" "I dined with friends at my club. You may inquire of them if you wish." Throughout this exchange, Sinclair's manner was polished, unruffled. Yet there was, in his eyes, as I thought, a subtle wariness as though he weighed every word for consequence. Holmes dismissed him courteously, but I saw that he remained thoughtful long after the door had closed behind the man. "Well, Watson," Holmes remarked at last, "what is your impression?" I confessed that Davies seemed nervous, Morton straightforward, and St. Clair rather too smooth for my liking. "Excellent," Holmes cried. "You grow perceptive." Nervousness, frankness, smoothness, each a mask, my dear fellow, concealing the underlying motive. But which mask hides the thief? That is the question. At that moment Lestrade entered, his expression smug. "Well, Mr. Holmes, I trust your examinations have confirmed what I told you. The boy Davies looks the likely sort. Shifty, pale, and with no alibi, save his mother. It's always the quiet ones." Holmes regarded the inspector with thinly veiled amusement. "You leap, as ever, Inspector, from shadow to conclusion. I have yet to see evidence of substance against Mr. Davies. Indeed, I suspect the truth lies not in what was confessed, but in what was omitted." "And what would that be?" Lestrade asked sharply. Holmes smiled enigmatically. "Patience, Inspector. The threads are delicate and must not be tugged too roughly lest they snap." After the interviews, Holmes requested a further tour of the strong room. He examined once more the shelves, the lock, the table, and the floor. Then with sudden energy he clambered upon a chair to inspect the narrow ventilation grating near the ceiling. Drawing forth a lens, he peered intently, then produced from his pocket a small knife with which he scraped the inner edge. He brought down a faint smudge of dust and something more, a trace of the same blue fibre we had observed earlier. "Watson," he exclaimed, "you see how the insignificant becomes crucial? A fibre here, a fragment of their threads, which, when woven, form a tapestry of truth. Whoever removed the Atlas, I dare say, did not leave through the door alone." Hartwell gasped. "You mean through the grating? But it is too small for a man." "Precisely," Holmes returned. "Therefore the Atlas must have been conveyed, not carried, but by what means and by whose contrivance that remains to be discerned." We left the Society that afternoon with more questions than answers, yet Holmes's expression betrayed no discouragement. On the contrary, I recognized in his eyes that gleam which signaled the hunt was afoot. "Watson," he murmured as we hailed a cab, "mark this well. There is a mind behind this theft which calculates with elegance. We are not contending with a common pilferer, but with one who has studied both locks and men. It will be a duel of wits, and I confess I look forward to the contest." As we rattled away into the fog, I felt once more the thrill of being at Holmes's side on the edge of a mystery. The atlas had vanished, without a trace, but the invisible threads were already gathering in my friend's keen grasp, and I sensed that soon they would lead us deeper into the labyrinth than any of us had yet imagined. The following day dawned with no improvement in the weather, for London lay still smothered beneath a blanket of damp mist, the gas lamps burning late into the morning, as though reluctant to concede defeat to daylight. I found Holmes already seated at the breakfast table, a single letter spread open beside his plate, while he consumed his coffee with the absent-minded air of one whose body attended to habit while the mind travelled elsewhere. "Watson," he said without preamble, "it seems that fortune has not left us idle. Mr. Hartwell has written that suspicions have fallen more heavily upon young Davies. It appears that after our departure yesterday, Inspector Lestrade pressed the fellow with further questions, and in his nervousness, Davies contradicted himself. The inspector is now convinced that we have our culprit." I set down my cup. "Do you share that opinion?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "I seldom share opinions, Watson. I prefer facts. But let us consider a nervous young man dependent upon his employment, suddenly questioned by police. Would it be astonishing if he stumbled in his replies? Contradiction under pressure is a symptom of fear, not necessarily of guilt. At that moment, a sharp knock resounded on our door, and Lestrade himself was admitted. He carried under his arm a small parcel, his expression triumphant. "Gentlemen," said he, "I have brought you evidence that should settle the matter once and for all." This was discovered in Davies' quarters, a scrap of parchment bearing a sketch most certainly from the Pelham Atlas. It must have been torn when the fellow mishandled the volume. He unwrapped the parcel and displayed the fragment, a piece of aged paper upon which were traced faint geographical outlines in a meticulous hand. I could not suppress a murmur, for the parchment was indeed of antique quality. Holmes examined it with his lens for several moments. "Curious?" he said at last. "Yes, very curious." Lestrade crossed his arms. "Curious, you say? To me it is conclusive. The boy took the atlas, then panicked and secreted this fragment. I intend to have him in custody before nightfall." Holmes replaced the lens in his pocket. "Inspector, you have an admirable directness of approach. Yet might I ask, who first discovered this fragment?" "His landlady. She was cleaning his room this morning." Holmes's eyebrows rose. "A landlady who cleans her lodger's room daily? That is devotion indeed." "And where precisely was the fragment found?" "Upon his writing desk in plain view," Lestrade replied. Holmes smiled faintly. "A thief, having risked so much for the atlas, then leaves incriminating evidence in plain view. It is too obvious, Inspector. Far too obvious. Forgive me, but the hand of artifice is plain." Lestrade flushed. "You will always find a complication, Holmes, even in the simplest of matters. Well, you may argue, but I shall do my duty. Davies will be arrested." With that he departed in high indignation, leaving us once more alone. Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "So, Watson, you perceive the trap. A scrap conveniently discovered bearing just enough resemblance to the atlas to cast suspicion. Yet no attempt is made to conceal it indeed. It is left where the merest glance would betray it. That is not the method of a cunning thief, but of one who desires a scapegoat." "Then you believe Davies is innocent?" I asked. "Innocent of the theft? Yes. Whether he is innocent of folly is another matter." By noon we were once again at the Society, where a scene of agitation awaited us. Davies, pale and trembling, was in the custody of 2 constables, while Mr. Hartwell protested weakly in his defence. St. Clair, the secretary, stood apart, his expression grave, and Morton looked on with cool detachment. "Mr. Holmes," Hartwell cried, "you must intervene. I cannot believe Davies guilty. He is clumsy, perhaps, but honest." Holmes raised his hand. "Peace, Mr. Hartwell. The matter will not be settled by clamour, let us see." He advanced upon the constables and requested leave to speak with the prisoner. Davies looked up with hunted eyes. "Mr. Holmes," he stammered, "I swear upon my honour I never touched the atlas save when ordered. I know nothing of that scrap. It is not mine." Holmes regarded him keenly. "Your innocence, Mr. Davies, will be proved or disproved by evidence, not by protestation. Tell me, who has visited your lodgings of late?" "Only Mr. Morton, sir. He called last week to discuss some cataloguing, and Mr. St. Clair once, some months ago." Holmes's eyes gleamed momentarily. "Ah, that is worth noting." "Very well, Davies. Courage, truth, has a way of prevailing even against appearances." Leaving the young man to the constables, Holmes turned to St. Clair. "Mr. Secretary, you mentioned yesterday that you had shown the atlas to a German scholar, Herr Vogel. May I inquire if you observed him closely?" St. Clair inclined his head. He was a courteous gentleman, most scholarly. His interest seemed purely academic. Holmes' gaze hardened. And yet the atlas disappears within days of his visit. Did he perhaps linger unusually long or show interest in the strong room itself? St. Clair hesitated, but replied smoothly. He admired the volume greatly, but nothing beyond what any man of learning might display. Holmes bowed slightly, though I detected in his eyes a spark of suspicion. Later, as we walked back through the foggy streets, I pressed Holmes. "Surely St. Clair's calmness is suspicious in itself? He is too polished, too ready with his explanations." "Your instincts serve you well, Watson," Holmes replied. "Yet Polish is not guilt. We must not condemn a man for composure. Still, I noted his hesitation when I questioned him on Vogel. It may prove significant. And what of Morton? A man who provides himself with an unimpeachable alibi must be considered carefully. Such readiness often suggests design. And Davies? Ah, poor Davies! He is the very image of a scapegoat, nervous, awkward, incapable of defending himself, a perfect victim for misdirection. Yet his mention of visitors to his lodgings is our first true thread." Holmes' eyes shone as we entered Baker Street once more. He flung himself into his chair and clasped his hands. "Watson, mark this, the scrap of parchment is a plant, not a clue. If Davies is innocent, then the hand that placed it there belongs to one who sought to mislead the Yard. We must discover whose interests are served by his arrest." I watched him with admiration. In my own mind, the mystery seemed only deepening into a morass of suspicion. Yet in his, the tangled skein was already assuming form. That evening Holmes wrote several letters, one to a correspondent in Berlin, another to a clerk of the Admiralty, and a third to an acquaintance at the docks. He dispatched them by special messenger, remarking only, "A case, Watson, is like a chessboard. Each move compels the next. Today our adversary moved a pawn in the shape of young Davies' arrest. Tomorrow we shall see what reply that compels from the true player." And with that he lit his pipe, his sharp features wreathed in smoke, while I marvelled yet again at the calm certainty with which he pursued truth amid shadows. The mystery of the stolen atlas had already ensnared one innocent victim, and I could not but fear what darker snares lay ahead before Holmes should unveil the hidden hand behind it all. The fog that clung to London that week seemed to deepen with each passing day, as though the very city conspired to cloak the truth of the affair from prying eyes. That evening, after Lestrade had triumphantly borne young Davies to the station, Holmes settled into his armchair with an air of concentration that forbade interruption. For some hours he neither spoke nor stirred, save to relight his pipe when it grew cold. I confess my patience was sorely tested, but I knew from experience that his silences were seldom idle. At last, near midnight, Holmes rose abruptly. "Watson," he said, "come with me." A short excursion, no more. Bring your revolver, though I do not expect danger." Accustomed as I was to his sudden impulses, I obeyed without protest. Within half an hour we were abroad in the thick night air, a hansom cab carrying us once more toward the quarter of the Geographical Society. We alighted at a narrow lane adjoining the building and, with the aid of a lantern, Holmes examined the exterior wall with meticulous care. "You perceive, Watson," he said, pointing upward, "the ventilation grating of which I spoke yesterday. Observe the discoloration upon the stone beneath it. The soot here has been disturbed, not recently perhaps, but enough to suggest that something was lowered or raised. I craned my neck and saw only a faint smear upon the masonry. Surely, Holmes, no man could have squeezed through such an aperture. Indeed, no, but a volume could. And what more suitable than a cord, lowered from within or without? Yet who, then, had access to both the strong room and this exterior wall?" Before I could reply, he climbed lightly upon a low ledge, and with some effort pried at the grating. It shifted slightly, enough to prove it had been tampered with. From his pocket he drew a small glass vial and a scrap of cloth. Carefully he wiped the edge and sealed the cloth away. "There, Watson, a trifle, perhaps, but trifles, as you know, are often the key to all." We returned to Baker Street, and while I sought the refuge of sleep, Holmes bent once more over his chemicals. When I awoke at dawn, he was still at his table, his eyes alight with the fierce satisfaction of discovery. "My dear fellow," he exclaimed, "this case grows more singular by the hour. Look here." He held up the scrap of cloth, upon which a faint blue stain was visible. "The fibre I recovered yesterday, and now this residue from the grating, both are identical. It is a dye used in certain military uniforms, though rarely in civilian dress. We are not dealing with a common thief, but with someone whose connections reach beyond the society." "Military?" I repeated in astonishment. "Is this indeed espionage?" Holmes smiled enigmatically. "Let us not gallop ahead of the facts. Espionage is but one possibility. Yet the presence of this dye, together with the convenience of Davy's incrimination, suggests a hand far more deliberate than mere chance. But let us keep this discovery between ourselves, Watson. For the present, neither Hartwell nor Lestrade shall hear of it." I stared at him in surprise. "But why conceal it, Holmes? Because," he replied, "knowledge is a weapon, and a weapon must be used at the proper moment. Reveal it too soon, and the enemy adapts. Hold it in reserve, and it strikes with force." Later that morning, Hartwell called upon us, his face drawn with worry. "Gentlemen," he said, "the trustees grow impatient. They demand the return of the atlas at any cost. If it is not recovered soon, the scandal will be irreparable." Holmes reassured him with calm courtesy, but after his departure turned to me with a more candid expression. "The pressure of the trustees may serve us, Watson. It will compel our adversary to act swiftly. A man who has woven such an artifice will not sit idle while suspicion shifts. He will make another move, and it is for us to be ready." That afternoon we visited Scotland Yard, ostensibly to observe Davies in his cell. The young man was pale, his hands trembling, as he protested his innocence once again. Lestrade, who accompanied us, remained unmoved. "You see, Mr. Holmes," said the inspector, "the fellow's nerves betray him. A guilty conscience." Holmes merely shrugged. "Perhaps. Or perhaps the conscience of an innocent man oppressed by false accusation. Time will tell." As we left the yard, Holmes pressed a coin into the hand of a constable. "You will do me a service," he whispered. "Keep me informed of any communications this prisoner receives." The man nodded eagerly, and we withdrew. On our return journey, Holmes appeared lost in thought. At length he said, "Watson, have you observed how conveniently this scrap of parchment appeared, and how swiftly suspicion fell upon the weakest party? The true thief must possess both cunning and influence. It is not enough to steal, he must also direct suspicion elsewhere. Such a mind will not rest content until the danger of discovery is wholly diverted. Therefore expect a second stroke more daring than the first." That evening, my companion busied himself with correspondence. One letter was dispatched to the War Office, another to a chemist of his acquaintance. When I inquired as to their purpose, he merely replied, "Information, Watson. Information is the currency with which we purchase truth." The following day brought an event that startled even me. As we breakfasted, a messenger arrived bearing a note for Holmes. He read it, his brows arching. As I predicted, our adversary makes his second move. He passed me the note. It was from Hartwell, written in a trembling hand. "Mr. Holmes, calamity has struck again. A second theft has occurred within the society. Pray come at once." Holmes leapt to his feet, his eyes alight. "Quickly, Watson, the game hastens. Another theft means our opponent grows bolder or more desperate. Either way, the veil will soon be lifted." We hurried into the fog, the city echoing with the clatter of our cab wheels. Yet Holmes, far from troubled, seemed exhilarated, like a huntsman closing upon his quarry. I, however, could not shake a growing unease, for though I trusted implicitly in Holmes's genius, I felt we had entered upon a contest not only of intellect, but of peril. Holmes must have read something of my apprehension, for as we drew near the society, he laid a hand upon my arm. "Courage, Watson," he said softly. "The darkest hour is often but a prelude to dawn, and I promise you this dawn shall break most dramatically." With that, he flung open the cab door, and together we strode into the very heart of the mystery, the echo of his words mingling with the muffled sounds of London's restless fog. The hansom drew up sharply before the steps of the Royal Geographical Society, and Holmes bounded out with a vigour that belied the hour. I followed in his wake, my medical bag bouncing against my side, though I doubted whether its contents would be of use in such a cerebral contest. Mr. Hartwell awaited us at the entrance, pale and breathless, his countenance marked by an agitation which told me he had scarcely slept since the first calamity. "Gentlemen," he cried, "this is ruin, absolute ruin. Come, I beg you, come at once." He led us swiftly through the great hall to the archives. The strong-room door stood ajar, the key still hanging from the lock. Inside, several members of the society huddled in dismay, their faces reflecting both anger and bewilderment. Upon the central table lay a velvet cloth, identical to the one from which the Pelham Atlas had been spirited away. But this time the absence was of another treasure, a portfolio of rare charts compiled by Captain James Cook during his second voyage. Hartwell pointed to the empty cloth with a trembling hand. "Gone, Mr. Holmes, gone, as if snatched by the very air. This morning I came to review the charts, and behold, vanished. Not a lock forced, not a hinge disturbed, precisely as with the Atlas." Holmes surveyed the room in silence, his eyes darting from the bare table to the faces of those present. He examined the lock, the hinges, the floor, and finally the ventilation grating with that hawk-like intensity which so often preceded revelation. "Again the same method," he murmured at last, "and again the same absence of disorder. Whoever our adversary is, he works with precision. But tell me, Mr. Hartwell, who was first to discover this second loss?" "I myself, only this morning. The room was locked all night, of that I am certain." Holmes drew a deep breath. "Then we may conclude that the theft occurred before the room was last sealed, or by one who holds the means of access beyond ordinary keys." At this point Lestrade bustled in, his features flushed with the exertion of his arrival. "Another theft!" he exclaimed. "Well, this settles it. That young Davies is guilty beyond a doubt. He is in our cells, yet his accomplices clearly continue his work. Holmes smiled faintly. Your logic, Inspector, would condemn a man for what he could not possibly have done. The fellow has been under lock and key all night, has he not? Then his confederates act for him, Lestrade retorted. Holmes turned away with a shrug. Perhaps. But I fancy the truth runs deeper. Let us not be deceived by appearances. He crossed to the grating and once again applied his lens. A faint smudge of soot clung to the edge, and Holmes scraped it away with his knife. The same substance, he murmured. Our thief is consistent, at least. Meanwhile, the assembled scholars whispered among themselves, and suspicion fell heavily upon Mr. Morton. Several pointed out that he had lingered late in the society on the evening before, ostensibly to arrange catalogues. Hartwell himself, though reluctant, admitted the truth of this. Mr. Morton, he said gravely, was the last to leave the building. I locked the doors myself after him. When questioned, Morton maintained his composure. I did remain late, he said calmly, but only to complete my work. I had no thought of theft, nor any opportunity to enter the strong room, yet his alibi of the lecture the night of the first theft seemed now less formidable, for the second crime had occurred in his proximity. The scholars muttered darkly, and I saw in Lestrade's eyes the gleam of triumph. Holmes, however, regarded Morton with a peculiar expression, part scrutiny and part amusement. He asked only, "And what precisely occupied you last night, sir? Cataloguing naval charts? The records will show my entries." "Indeed," Holmes said softly, "records are excellent witnesses when they are truthful." The tension in the room was palpable. Hartwell wrung his hands. "Gentlemen, this must end. 2 of our greatest treasures lost and still no culprit in custody. The trustees will demand resignations and the society's name will be dragged through scandal." Holmes laid a hand lightly upon the curator's arm. "Patience, Mr. Hartwell. A net is being woven, finer than any you perceive. The fish is not yet drawn, but the current sets toward him." He requested permission to inspect the library adjoining the strong room. There, among shelves of volumes, he moved swiftly, pausing before a window that overlooked the same alley we had examined the previous night. He opened the sash and peered out. "Ah," he exclaimed, "do you see, Watson? This window aligns directly with the grating. A cord lowered from here would reach the aperture precisely. And who, pray, had access to this library late last night?" Hartwell admitted that any member of the staff could enter, though it was ordinarily deserted after dusk. Holmes tapped the sill thoughtfully. "Then we must seek not merely who could enter, but who would contrive to use such access." A bold hand indeed. By afternoon, the news of the second theft had spread through the city. The evening papers carried sensational headlines: "Another outrage at the Geographical Society." Rumours of espionage abounded, and the Foreign Office dispatched an official inquiry. The gravity of the case was now undeniable. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated rather than troubled. That evening, as we sat once more in our Baker Street rooms, he paced the carpet with rapid strides, his eyes gleaming. "Watson," he declared, "we stand at the very edge of revelation. Consider 2 thefts, each executed without visible entry, each leaving behind traces of the same fibre and soot. One man is conveniently arrested, another falls under suspicion, yet the true thief moves still unseen. Do you not perceive the hand that guides these events?" I confessed that I did not. Holmes smiled. "Then be assured you shall, for I have in my possession the clue that will unmask him, but until the moment ripens, I shall keep it close. An adversary of this calibre deserves no less." Though he spoke lightly, I could not mistake the intensity of his gaze, nor the restless energy with which he moved. He wrote late into the night, dispatched further notes by messenger, and at last threw himself upon the sofa, his long fingers steepled, his eyes half closed in meditation. "Watson," he murmured as I prepared to retire, "you will recall that chessboard of which I spoke. Today our opponent moved a knight. Tomorrow I shall answer with a stratagem of my own. Pray that I play it well, for the stakes have never been higher. And so, with the society in turmoil, the yard pressing its accusations, and our unseen adversary emboldened, we stood upon the brink of discovery. The mystery had grown deeper, the danger greater, yet I could not doubt that Holmes, in his silent, tireless way, was already shaping the decisive move that would turn the tide of the contest. The day that followed was one of the most curious I have ever spent in Holmes's company, for it seemed that he had adopted a new manner, restless, abrupt, and curiously evasive speech. He prowled about our sitting-room like a caged panther, snatching at papers, peering through his lens at scraps of evidence, and muttering fragments of deduction beneath his breath. To my repeated inquiries, he offered little but cryptic phrases. "All is converging, Watson. The pieces draw together. The thief thinks himself safe, but he has overlooked the most trivial of facts, and in that triviality lies his undoing." "What fact, Holmes?" I pressed. He gave me one of his sardonic smiles. "If I told you, my dear fellow, it would spoil the effect." "Patience a little longer. By tonight we shall make progress." I could not but note that he sent 2 telegrams before noon, one, as I observed, to Inspector Lestrade, and the other, whose address I did not see, to a correspondent abroad. Afterward he busied himself with a trunk that contained his remarkable collection of disguises. When next I looked up from my newspaper, Holmes stood before me transformed into a shabby clerk, his posture stooped, his face altered by side whiskers and a pair of pince-nez. "You see, Watson, our adversary must be watched, and he would scarcely suffer my scrutiny were I to present myself openly. This afternoon I shall vanish into the byways of London, but do not be alarmed. Your task is to accompany Lestrade to the Society at 8 o'clock, when I have arranged a small gathering. By then, I trust, the net will have been drawn tight." With that enigmatic instruction he departed, leaving me to spend a restless day in speculation. Evening came at last, and I joined Lestrade outside the Society. The inspector was in high spirits, convinced that Holmes had at last bowed to his conviction of Davies's guilt. "You'll see, Doctor," he declared. "Holmes may dance about with his magnifying glass, but in the end it comes down to plain evidence. That scrap of parchment will hang the lad." I offered no reply, knowing it was futile to argue with Lestrade's obstinacy. Together we entered the great hall, where several figures already awaited us. Mr. Hartwell, pale and anxious Morton, composed as ever, and St. Clair, dignified, his manner one of carefully measured concern. Holmes was nowhere to be seen, and I confess a pang of unease passed through me. But scarcely had we taken our seats, when the door opened, and in shuffled an unremarkable clerk with bowed shoulders and a bundle of papers. I was about to protest at the intrusion when, with a swift movement, the clerk straightened, removed his whiskers and spectacles, and revealed the keen features of Sherlock Holmes. The effect was electric. Hartwell gasped, Morton started visibly, and even Lestrade uttered an exclamation. Holmes smiled faintly as he laid the bundle upon the table. "Gentlemen," said he, "I thank you for your attendance. We stand at the climax of a mystery which has perplexed not only this society but also Scotland Yard. Tonight I propose to resolve it, but first I must request that the strong-room be secured, and that no man leave this building until I have concluded my demonstration." His authority was such that none ventured protest. A constable stationed himself at the door, and Holmes began his peculiar preparations. From his bundle he produced a length of stout cord, a pulley, and a small canvas sack. He fixed the pulley to the library window with astonishing dexterity, ran the cord through it, and lowered the sack until it swung before the grating of the strong room. "Observe, Watson," he said, "how readily an object might be conveyed from within to without disturbing lock or hinge. A confederate in the alley below receives it, and the treasure is spirited away. But also, such a plan requires knowledge of the building's architecture, access to the library, and the confidence to tamper undetected." Hartwell groaned. Then it was indeed an inside job. Holmes inclined his head. "Indubitably. The question is whose hand guided the cord." He paused, his eyes sweeping the assembly. Morton shifted uneasily, St. Clair met his gaze with outward composure, and Lestrade smirked, convinced the answer must be Davy's. At that instant, a constable entered, bearing a small packet. Holmes opened it, and inside lay a fragment of cloth, stained faintly with blue dye. He held it aloft. "This, gentleman, I obtained from the grating itself. It matches precisely the fibre discovered within the strong room, and today I verified its original uniform cloth issued exclusively to a certain regiment. Which of you, I ask, has such a connection?" For the first time, St. Clair's composure faltered. His lips tightened, and a flush rose upon his cheek. Morton's eyes darted toward him involuntarily, a gesture not lost on Holmes. "Patience," Holmes said softly. "I have not been accused yet. Instead, I shall set a trap. Tonight, a false volume shall be placed upon that table, bound in the same manner as the Pelham Atlas. If our adversary believes it genuine, he will attempt once more to employ his ingenious contrivance. But this time, gentlemen, he shall find that the fish which wriggles for the bait is caught fast in the hook." He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, you will station men both within the library and in the alley below. Watson, you and I shall remain hidden in the strong room. Let us see whose hand reaches for forbidden knowledge." And so the plan was laid. Hartwell produced a great folio resembling the lost atlas, and it was placed upon the velvet cloth. The gas lamps were dimmed, and the company withdrew, each man to his appointed post. In the gloom of the strong room, I crouched beside Holmes, my nerves strung tight as a violin string. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the ticking of my watch and the faint drip of water from some distant pipe. Holmes, motionless as a statue, scarcely seemed to breathe. At last, near midnight, a faint creak reached our ears. The grating above stirred. Slowly, cautiously, a cord descended, the loop at its end groping for the folio. My heart hammered as the loop tightened around the volume, lifting it inch by inch. Holmes touched my arm lightly. "Steady, Watson. The play nears its climax." We watched as the volume rose toward the grating. Then, with sudden swiftness, Holmes leapt forward, seized the cord, and gave a sharp tug. A cry sounded from the library above, and the trap was sprung. Shouts echoed through the halls, boots pounded upon the floor, and the door of the strong room burst open as Lestrade and his men rushed in. Holmes, still gripping the cord, smiled grimly. "Gentlemen," he said, "our quarry has taken the bait. Now we shall see who among you has the courage to claim it." Even as he spoke, we heard the scuffle of men above, and the constables dragging someone down the stairs. The figure who emerged, dishevelled and gasping, was none other than Holmes raised a hand. "Not yet, Inspector. Let the scene play out. All in good time the mask shall be stripped and the true thief revealed." And with that enigmatic declaration, he turned once more to the cord, his eyes glittering with anticipation, while the rest of us stood in tense silence, knowing the climax of the affair was at last upon us. The commotion that followed the snapping of Holmes's trap was of such magnitude that for a few moments all was confusion. Boots tramped heavily in the corridor above, voices shouted orders and protests, and the echo of a struggle reverberated down the stairwell. Then, with constables pressing close at either side, The captive was thrust into the strong room. It was Mr. Morton. His usually composed countenance was dishevelled, his collar torn, and his eyes flashed with a mixture of defiance and dismay. For the first time since our acquaintance, his habitual calm deserted him. Lestrade could scarcely contain his satisfaction. "There, Mr. Holmes," he crowed, rubbing his hands. "Caught in the very act. What do you know of your fine theories? The man was trying to lift the volume, even as you predicted. Well, that should settle it." Holmes regarded Morton with a strange expression, one half amusement, one half pity. "Settle it? My dear Inspector, it merely begins to illuminate it. We must not mistake the bait for the banquet. Still, it is an instructive capture." Morton drew himself up with as much dignity as remained to him. "I protest, Mr. Holmes, this is an infamous trick. I am no thief. I came here because I suspected that mischief was still afoot, and wished to guard the Society's property." Holmes' lips curved in a sardonic smile. "An admirable excuse, sir, one which shall doubtless be weighed with interest by a magistrate. And yet why employ a cord and pulley to guard a volume? Why approach through stealth rather than in the open?" Morton's lips moved, but no answer came forth. Lestrade clapped him on the shoulder. "We've heard enough. He'll sleep in the yard cells tonight. Davies will be released and justice served." Holmes raised a languid hand. "Justice, Inspector, has many chambers, some darker than others. Before you hasten away, grant me leave to examine our prisoner a little further." Reluctantly, Lestrade acquiesced, and Holmes advanced until he stood at a pace from Morton. For a long moment he studied him with that piercing gaze which seemed to read the soul itself. Then, in a voice low yet commanding, he said, "You have played your part with skill, Mr. Morton. You possessed knowledge of the building, you devised the cord and pulley, and you arranged your alibis with commendable foresight. And yet there is a detail you overlooked, a trifle, but one which speaks volumes. Shall I tell you?" Morton's face blanched. "I know nothing of your trifles." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "It was you who visited Davies' lodgings under pretence of consultation. It was you who placed the scrap of parchment upon his desk. You sought to deflect suspicion from yourself by fastening it upon the weakest link. That was cunning, but clumsy. For the parchment bore a cut not from careless handling, but from deliberate trimming with a sharp blade, the very blade you use daily in your cataloguing. The angle of the cut is distinctive, as I observed in the library yesterday." A murmur swept the room. Morton's composure wavered, but still he held silence. Holmes turned suddenly to Lestrade. "Inspector, do you not perceive? Here is the architect of deception, yet not the ultimate thief. For Morton is but the hand, not the brain. The deeper design lies elsewhere." At this, every eye turned instinctively to St. Clair, who had remained until now in dignified silence. He adjusted his cuffs with deliberate calm and said smoothly, "Really, Mr. Holmes, this is beyond endurance. First poor Davies, now Morton. Will you accuse every officer of the Society in turn until none remain unblemished?" Holmes's gaze fixed upon him like steel. "Perhaps not every officer, Mr. St. Clair. Only those whose masks slip when the wind blows." For the first time, I saw a flicker of unease in the secretary's polished demeanour. He turned slightly, as if to avoid the full blaze of Holmes's eyes. Holmes continued in that cold, deliberate tone which boded ill for those who faced it. "Consider the sequence, gentlemen. First, Davies is accused through evidence planted at his home. Then Morton, by his own folly, is caught in the act of repeating the theft. Yet who benefits from their disgrace? Who stands untouched, dignified, respectable, above suspicion? Why, the secretary, of course, the man who controls access to the strong room, who entertains foreign scholars, who commands the confidence of the trustees. Is it not an elegant arrangement? Lestrade started. You mean Saint Clair? Holmes raised a hand. Patience, Inspector. The time for direct accusation is not yet. Tonight we have shown the method of the theft and exposed the tool by which it was carried out. The motive and the master remain. Tomorrow, if you will grant me that much indulgence, I shall produce the final link which binds the chain. Hartwell, nearly overcome by the strain, exclaimed, Mr. Holmes, we beg you, if you have knowledge, reveal it now. The honour of the society cannot endure further delay. Holmes's expression softened. My dear sir, I sympathise, but premature revelation would risk the escape of the true culprit. One more day, and all shall be laid bare. Until then, let Morton remain in custody, but without formal charge. He is still useful to us. Lestrade grumbled, but consented, persuaded by Holmes's authority, if not by his reasoning. The assembly broke up in confusion. Morton escorted away under guard, St. Clair, outwardly composed, but with a shadow in his eye, and Hartwell clinging desperately to Holmes's assurance. When at last we returned to Baker Street, I could restrain my curiosity no longer. Holmes, I cried, you surely have solved the case. Why then hold back the name of the thief? You know it is St. Clair. Holmes removed his coat and cast himself into his chair. Watson, you see much, but not yet enough. St. Clair, yes, the mask slips, the air trembles, but to accuse him without the keystone would be folly. The web is woven, but the spider must reveal itself fully before we strike. That moment is close at hand. He closed his eyes, fingers steepled, his lips moving in silent calculation. Presently he murmured, Tomorrow we bait the final snare. And then, Watson, you shall see not merely the thief of maps, but the mind that plotted to shake the very foundations of the empire. His words sent a shiver through me. For the first time I realized that the theft of the Pelham Atlas was no petty crime, but part of a design whose scope reached far beyond the quiet chambers of the Geographical Society. The stakes were no longer scholarly pride, but matters of international weight. And as I looked upon my friend, I marvelled that one man's genius could hold such forces in check, balanced upon the slender thread of a trifle. The morning after Morton's capture dawned bleak and raw, the fog hanging heavy over Baker Street. I found Holmes already astir, his lean figure silhouetted against the window, his gaze fixed on the murk beyond as though he could pierce its depths by sheer force of thought. His violin lay upon the chair, the bow idle across the strings, mute testimony to a night spent not in music, but in silent calculation. Watson, he said abruptly as I entered, today we strike. The web has been spun, the fly has blundered within, and now we have to close the net. You will accompany me to the society at noon. Bring your revolver. There is danger. I obeyed without question, though my mind teemed with speculation. Was Morton merely a dupe? Was St. Clair the true spider, his polished exterior, but a mask for treachery? Holmes offered no further clue, merely pacing the room with restless strides until the appointed hour. At 12 precisely, we arrived at the Royal Geographical Society. The trustees had assembled in the great hall, their faces stern with indignation. Hartwell hovered anxiously at Holmes's side, while Lestrade, stout and self-satisfied, stood ready to claim the credit he was certain was his due. St. Clair entered last, calm and immaculate, his demeanour as unruffled as though no suspicion had ever been whispered against him. Holmes mounted the dais at the end of the hall, his figure tall and commanding, his eyes flashing with the peculiar brilliance that came upon him in such moments. He held in his hand a bundle of papers and the small scrap of cloth stained with blue dye. "Gentlemen," he began, "you have suffered grievous injury. The treasures of your society have been stolen, your honour imperilled, and suspicion cast upon innocent men. Today I shall lay before you the truth and name the culprit who plotted this design." A murmur ran through the assembly. St. Clair folded his arms, his expression one of dignified skepticism. Morton, pale and hollow-eyed, was brought in under guard to hear the pronouncement. Holmes raised the cloth fragment. This, as I have shown, was found upon the grating through which the atlas and charts were conveyed. It is no common cloth, but part of a uniform issued only to officers of the Royal Engineers. A curious coincidence, is it not, that Mr. Algernon St. Clair once held a commission in that very corps? A stir passed through the hall. St. Clair's lips tightened, but he did not speak. Holmes continued, his voice rising. Morton was the tool. He devised the cord and pulley. He carried out the thefts. He planted false evidence upon Davies, but whose hand guided him? Who supplied him with knowledge of which volumes to steal, and to whom they should be delivered? Who but the secretary, the man who commanded the keys, who entertained a German scholar with suspicious eagerness, who stood above reproach while others were discredited? Lestrade barked, "You hear that, St. Clair? What do you have to say?" The secretary at last spoke, his voice calm but edged with scorn. "I say that Mr. Holmes has spun a fantasy worthy of the stage. Yes, I once held a commission, as many gentlemen have. Yes, I introduced a scholar to our collection. What of it? To accuse me of theft on such grounds is preposterous." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Preposterous? Then explain, if you can, how this scrap of your handwriting," he held aloft a slip of paper, "was discovered in Morton's lodgings, bearing instructions for the precise times at which the strong-room would be unattended. Explain why the ink upon it matches that in your own study, and why the hand is unmistakably yours. Explain why, when I examined your desk yesterday in your absence, I found fibres of the same blue cloth caught in the hinge, fibres torn from a uniform you once owned, and, I dare say, still possess." For the first time St. Clair's composure cracked. A flush rose to his cheek, and his hands clenched at his sides. Holmes pressed on, relentless. "You see, gentlemen, the theft was no act of avarice, but of calculation. The Pelham Atlas contained notes of unratified treaties, observations of strategic harbours, hints of boundaries not yet fixed. Such knowledge would be of immense value to a foreign power. The second theft of the Cook charts was but to deepen the misdirection, to suggest mere antiquarian zeal. But in truth both were steps in a design to sell this nation's secrets abroad." Hartwell gave a cry of horror. The trustees murmured indignantly, and Lestrade's face grew red with astonishment. Holmes turned upon Morton, who shrank beneath his gaze. "You were the craftsman, Morton, but you lacked the vision. St. Clair promised you gain, protection, perhaps even advancement, and so you lent him your hands. But without his guidance, you would never have known what to steal, nor how to place suspicion upon Davies. Is it not so?" Morton buried his face in his hands, sobbing. "It is true," he whispered hoarsely. "I was his tool. He promised wealth. He said no one would suffer. He said it was only knowledge, that no harm would come." All eyes turned now upon St. Clair, whose proud bearing crumbled at last. He sank into a chair, his face ashen. Holmes's voice rang out, cold and inexorable. "Algernon St. Clair, you stand revealed as the architect of this treachery. The planted evidence, the scapegoats, the calm assurance, each was but a veil. You exploited the trust of this society, and through your ambition you imperiled the crown itself." Lestrade sprang forward, clapping a hand upon the man's shoulder. "In the name of the law, you are under arrest." St. Clair made one last attempt at dignity. "You will regret this, Holmes. There are powers at work greater than your comprehension." His words were cut short as he was led away, his head bowed. The trustees broke into a babel of indignation and relief. Hartwell seized Holmes's hand. "Sir, you have saved us. The honour of the society is preserved thanks to your genius." Holmes merely inclined his head. "The honour of the society is but a trifle, Mr. Hartwell. The true danger lay in the misuse of knowledge for political gain. That danger is now averted, or at least diminished." When at last we departed, the fog had lifted slightly, and a pale sun glimmered weakly through the clouds. As we rode back to Baker Street, I studied Holmes's profile, sharp and austere against the light. "You were magnificent, Holmes," I said warmly. "To unravel such a skein, to pierce such deception, it was a triumph." He gave a thin smile. "Triumph, Watson? A necessary task, perhaps, but not triumph. The true criminal is not always the man in the dock, but the motive that drives him, the hunger for power, the lust for influence. St. Clair will face his punishment, but the currents that carried him remain. That, alas, is beyond even my poor powers to arrest." I pondered his words in silence, struck anew by the mixture of brilliance and melancholy in my friend. For though the thief was unmasked and the society saved, Holmes saw not victory, but the shadow of greater struggles yet to come. The days that followed the dramatic exposure of Algernon St. Clair were marked by a whirlwind of official proceedings and public astonishment. The morning newspapers blazed the affair across their columns: treachery at the Geographical Society, secretary arrested for theft of state secrets, and Holmes unmasks spy in learned institution. Each account, with varying accuracy, described how the distinguished secretary of the Royal Geographical Society had conspired to purloin documents of value to foreign powers, using his subordinate Morton as the instrument of the crime. For my own part, I found myself besieged with inquiries from colleagues and acquaintances eager for every detail of the case. Though discretion forbade me from revealing all, I could not help but relate with some pride the manner in which Holmes had unravelled the tangled skein. Yet Holmes himself appeared curiously unmoved by the acclaim. "It is a commonplace affair, Watson," he remarked one evening, as he sat before the fire, his long fingers steepled, his gaze fixed upon the flames. "An ambitious man, a pliant accomplice, and the lure of power that is the story in every age. The names alter, but the theme is constant. If I am praised for perceiving what was already written upon the wall, it is undeserved," I protested warmly. "Surely, Holmes, no other could have disentangled such a web. Morton deceived even the closest of observers, and St. Clair stood above suspicion. Without your deductions, both the atlas and the Cook charts would be in foreign hands at this very moment." Holmes smiled faintly. "Perhaps. Yet the greater peril lies not in what was stolen, but in what nearly lost the integrity of knowledge itself. When men treat learning as a coin to be bartered for influence, the world is poorer for it." During that week we received several visits from Hartwell, who expressed his gratitude with a sincerity that was touching. The trustees of the society passed a formal vote of thanks to Holmes, though I observed that he accepted it with his customary detachment. "The society is preserved, Watson," Holmes said after Hartwell had departed one evening, "but let us not forget that it was nearly ruined from within. A fortress is seldom stormed from without until it has been betrayed by treachery within. That is a lesson which even learned men must learn anew." Meanwhile, Lestrade strutted about in the glow of publicity, claiming much of the credit for himself. I could not but smile when I read one report in which he was described as the vigilant inspector whose foresight prepared the way for Mr. Holmes' final stroke. Holmes himself chuckled dryly at the passage. "Let him enjoy his laurels, Watson. They will not wither on my own. Lestrade is an honest fellow in his way, though somewhat limited in vision. If the world chooses to magnify his part, it harms no one. Morton, I learned, had turned King's evidence. Faced with the weight of proof and the prospect of a heavy sentence, he confessed his complicity and provided testimony that confirmed Holmes's deductions. He declared that St. Clair had promised him wealth and influence in return for his aid, assuring him that the thefts would pass unnoticed as antiquarian misplacements. It was Morton who had cut the scrap from an obscure chart, planting it in Davy's lodgings to divert suspicion. Yet, as Holmes observed, the cut betrayed him. The smallest incision reveals the surgeon. As for St. Clair, he awaited trial under heavy guard. Reports suggested that his fall from grace had sent shockwaves through polite society, for he had long been regarded as a man of culture and refinement. Holmes observed the matter with a cold detachment that bordered upon disdain. "Respectability, Watson," he remarked, "is the last refuge of scoundrels. It is a cloak woven of manners and polish, beneath which corruption festers. The true detective's task is to strip away the cloak, however finely tailored." It was on a grey afternoon, a fortnight after the conclusion of the case, that Holmes and I walked along the embankment. The Thames rolled sluggishly beneath the arches, its waters reflecting the dim light of the winter sky. Holmes was silent for a time, his gaze fixed upon the river, until at last he spoke. "Do you recall, Watson, that I told you the explanation would be earthly, though devilishly clever? You see how it was a cord, a pulley, a grating no more, a schoolboy's trick if you reduce it to its essence, and yet, by that trick, men sought to alter the balance of empires. It is a curious thought." I nodded, struck by the incongruity. "And yet, Holmes, it was not the device that mattered, but the mind behind it." "Precisely, Watson. The simplest tool becomes formidable in the hand of ambition. That is why vigilance must never slumber." We walked on in silence, the fog curling about us like a veil. Presently Holmes turned with a sudden smile. "Come, my dear fellow, enough of philosophy. Mrs. Hudson has promised us a beefsteak pudding, and I confess the contest has left me with an appetite." And so, with the mystery resolved and the honour of the society restored, we returned once more to our quiet rooms at Baker Street. Yet, in my heart, I knew that this case, like so many before it, would linger in my memory, not only for the brilliance with which Holmes had unveiled the truth, but for the glimpse it offered into the shadows where learning, ambition, and treachery converge. As I set down these notes in my journal that night, I could not but feel a surge of admiration for my friend. The world might applaud or misunderstand him as it pleased, but to me he remained what he had always been, the one mind capable of bringing light into the darkest labyrinth, and of turning even the theft of an atlas into a lesson in the frailty of human honour. Thus ended the strange affair of the stolen atlas, another chapter in the long record of Sherlock Holmes's triumphs, and one more proof that no crime, however cloaked in cunning, could long resist the piercing gaze of his unrivalled intellect. It was some weeks after the final exposure of Algernon St. Clair that I found leisure to reflect upon the case in its entirety and to set my notes in order. The newspapers, which had at first blazoned the affair with sensational headlines, soon relegated it to the back columns, for London is a city quick to tire of scandal. The public appetite for fresh outrage had turned to other matters. Yet within the circles of government and learned institutions the reverberations lingered long, and I was often stopped by acquaintances eager for some authentic word concerning the man who had once been regarded as a model of probity. St. Clair's trial was held in camera, for reasons of state. His long connection with certain ministries, his access to sensitive documents, and his consorting with foreign agents made it imperative that the matter not be laid bare in open court. Morton's testimony, together with Holmes's meticulous demonstration, proved overwhelming. The secretary was convicted of high treason and sentenced to a term of penal servitude, a fate which, though ignominious, spared him the harsher penalties that might otherwise have been inflicted. Morton himself was shown some measure of mercy, his role judged as subordinate, and his remorse considered genuine. As for poor Davies, his name was cleared entirely, and he was reinstated in his position, though the ordeal had left him shaken in spirit. Hartwell visited us at Baker Street more than once in the days following, his gratitude as fervent as when Holmes first unravelled the conspiracy. He brought with him letters of thanks from the trustees, together with a handsome gift of rare volumes for Holmes's library. My friend accepted them with a courtesy that barely concealed his indifference. "Knowledge," said he, "is its own reward, Mr. Hartwell. If I have preserved a few scraps from the flames, I am content. But I beg you, let the Society guard its treasures with a vigilance that does not rely upon outsiders. Once is a misfortune, twice would be negligence." Hartwell departed much impressed, though perhaps puzzled by Holmes's lack of triumphalism. Indeed, I confess that even I was at times frustrated by his refusal to bask in the glory he so richly deserved. For my own part, I could scarcely walk the streets without being congratulated on my connection with the great detective, and I took a quiet pride in my humble share of the adventure. One evening, as we sat together by the fire, I ventured to press him on the subject. "Holmes," I said, "do you never tire of treating your victories as trifles? The world acclaims you, yet you shrug it off as though it were nothing." He smiled thinly, drawing upon his pipe. "My dear Watson, the world acclaims what it does not understand. To see a puzzle solved is to feel momentarily reassured that chaos has limits. But for me, the matter is merely an exercise in logic. Once the solution is reached, the interest fades. Would you expect a mathematician to exult in every sum he performs? But surely, I protested, to preserve the honour of the Society, to prevent the betrayal of the Crown, these are no trifles." "Trifles to me, Watson," he returned. "The magnitude of the consequences is for others to measure. My task is the same whether it concerns an empire or a missing umbrella to observe, to reason, to deduce. The rest is commentary." He lapsed into silence, and I watched him with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. Such was the man aloof, detached, yet possessed of a brilliance that dazzled all who came within its orbit. A few days later, we received a visit from Inspector Lestrade, who entered with the air of a man bearing important news. He reported that Sinclair had at last confessed fully, admitting that he had been in correspondence with certain agents abroad, to whom he intended to deliver the Pelham Atlas in exchange for considerable sums. The Cook charts, he explained, had been chosen as a secondary target precisely to mask the true purpose of the theft, lending it the appearance of antiquarian greed rather than political treachery. Holmes listened with polite interest, though without surprise. "The confession adds nothing to what we already knew, Inspector. It is the common failing of criminals to imagine that their cunning will pass undetected, when in truth every contrivance bears the signature of its author. Sinclair's polished composure was the very mask that betrayed him." Lestrade departed in good humour, basking in the reflected glory of the case, and Holmes returned to his violin. As I looked back upon the affair, certain images stood out with peculiar vividness: the dim strong-room with its empty table, the scrap of cloth stained blue, the cord descending stealthily through the grating, and above all, the moment when Holmes, with quiet authority, stripped away the last pretense and laid bare the heart of the conspiracy. Each detail formed part of a mosaic, and together they revealed the unmistakable pattern of genius at work. Yet it was not until a fortnight later that the case reached its true conclusion in my mind. Holmes and I were seated at breakfast when Mrs. Hudson brought in a letter. Holmes opened it with a glance, then passed it across to me. It was from Davies, written in a hand still unsteady from his ordeal. "My dear Mr. Holmes, Pray accept once more my heartfelt gratitude for your efforts on my behalf. But for you, I should now be ruined, an innocent man condemned. I shall never forget your words of encouragement when all seemed lost. Though I cannot repay you, know that I shall ever hold your name in reverence." Holmes read my face as I set down the letter. "You see, Watson," said gently, "that is the true reward, the knowledge that one has spared an honest man from injustice. The plaudits of society are dust compared to that. I was moved, though I scarcely showed it." For all his aloofness, Holmes possessed a core of humanity which revealed itself only in such fleeting moments. The day wore on, and by evening he had already turned his mind to a fresh enigma, some matter involving a peculiar cipher received from the Admiralty. He spoke of it with an eagerness that reminded me how quickly his attention leapt from one puzzle to the next. "Watson!" he exclaimed, his eyes alight. "Here is a singular challenge, a message of numbers interspersed with curious symbols, surely the hand of an experienced cryptographer. What say you to a journey to Portsmouth on the morning train?" I could only smile. The case of the stolen atlas, with all its perils and triumphs, was scarcely closed, and yet Holmes's restless intellect demanded fresh sustenance. Such was his nature to conquer one labyrinth only to plunge at once into another, and so I set down the account of the mystery of the stolen atlas as one more testament to my friend's genius. It was a tale of deception and treachery, of ambition cloaked in respectability, and of knowledge nearly lost to foreign hands. Yet it was also, to my mind, a reminder that no disguise, however artful, could withstand the piercing gaze of Sherlock Holmes. Thus the curtain fell upon that drama, and the stage was set for others yet to come, each no doubt as strange and compelling as the last. For in the quiet of Baker Street, amid the smoke of his pipe and the strains of his violin, dwelt the one mind capable of bringing light into London's darkest corners, the mind of my friend and companion, Sherlock Holmes.